What would you do if your family's closest friend turned out to be your worst enemy? They had no idea the man who came to their Sunday barbecues held the key to the most agonizing mystery of their lives. When hunters stumbled upon a rusted sedan in the dried lake bed of Lake Pleasant Reservoir, north of Phoenix, Arizona, in October 2012, they had no idea they'd just solved a cold case from 1989. The victim was Vanessa, a 30-year-old real estate agent who vanished without a trace in March of that year. What investigators uncovered about her final hours was more disturbing than anyone could imagine. This missing person case had haunted Maricopa County for over 2 decades, but the shocking truth was closer to home than anyone suspected. March 1989 marked one of the driest winters Arizona had seen in years. The desert landscape around Phoenix stretched endlessly under cloudless skies, and life moved at its own rhythm in the sprawling suburbs. Vanessa worked at Desert Realty, a small firm in central Phoenix, where she'd built a reputation for her warmth and persistence. She loved the work, meeting families searching for their dream homes, showing properties across the valley from Scottsdale to Glendale. That Friday evening in late March, Vanessa stayed late at the office finishing paperwork for a closing scheduled the following week. Her colleague Jennifer waved goodbye around 7, leaving Vanessa alone under the fluorescent lights. The parking lot outside was nearly empty when Vanessa finally locked up and walked to her silver Honda Accord. She slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled onto Camelback Road heading west toward home. Her husband waited with dinner, warming in the oven. By 9, he glanced at the clock, then at the phone. By 10, worry crept into his chest. He dialed her office, letting it ring endlessly into the empty building. By midnight, panic overtook him. He called the Phoenix Police Department to report his wife missing, his voice breaking as he described her car, her clothes, the route she should have taken home. The police opened a missing person file that night, sending patrol units along Camelback Road and checking the hospital emergency rooms. But in a sprawling desert city, where highways stretched for miles and darkness swallowed everything beyond the streetlights, a single silver sedan could disappear without a trace. From that moment, one haunting question gripped not just her family, but the entire community. Where did Vanessa go, and who was responsible for her disappearance? Phoenix police arrived at the Desert Realty office before dawn on Saturday. Detective Arthur Larkin, a 42-year-old investigator with the Missing Persons Unit, stepped out of his unmarked sedan into the parking lot where Vanessa was last seen alive. The asphalt stretched empty under the streetlights, surrounded by low commercial buildings and quiet roads leading toward the interstate. Arthur walked the perimeter, his trained eyes scanning for anything unusual. Tire marks crisscrossed the lot, but nothing stood out. No signs of struggle, no abandoned belongings, no witnesses who'd seen anything suspicious that Friday evening. He interviewed Jennifer, the colleague who'd left before Vanessa, but she remembered nothing out of the ordinary, just another quiet night at the office. Meanwhile, search teams fanned out across northwest Phoenix. Officers drove along Interstate 17 heading north toward the desert, checking roadside ditches and pull-offs. Helicopters swept over the Sonoran landscape, their spotlights cutting through darkness, searching for any glint of silver metal that might be Vanessa's Honda Accord. The Arizona heat would be brutal come morning, but through the cool pre-dawn hours, dozens of volunteers joined the effort. At home, her family couldn't just sit and wait. Her husband printed hundreds of flyers with Vanessa's photo, her warm smile frozen in time. The words, "Missing Person," printed in bold letters beneath. By sunrise Saturday, he and neighbors were taping them to telephone poles along Camelback Road, posting them in grocery store windows, handing them to anyone who'd take one. Noah, only 7 years old, sat on the living room floor watching adults move frantically around him. He didn't fully understand why everyone looked so scared, why his mother hadn't come home, why his father's eyes were red and swollen. He clutched his favorite toy, waiting for his mom to walk through the door, like she always did. But the hours stretched on, and that door stayed closed. The community rallied fast. By Saturday afternoon, the local news channels were broadcasting Vanessa's photo across the Phoenix metro area. Channel 12 ran a segment showing her real estate headshot, describing her car, asking anyone with information to call the police hotline immediately. Spanish and English radio stations urged listeners to keep their eyes open. Churches across Maricopa County added her name to their prayer lists. But as the weekend passed, this missing person case seemed to hit a dead end at every turn. Police checked hospitals throughout the valley, contacted her family in California, reviewed her phone records for anything suspicious. They found nothing that explained where Vanessa could have gone. No financial troubles, no enemies, no reason to vanish voluntarily. Her bank account hadn't been touched since Friday morning. Her credit cards showed no activity. Detective Arthur questioned her husband extensively, a standard procedure that made the grieving man feel like a suspect in his own home. Under harsh office lighting, he recounted every detail from that Friday. Vanessa called around 6, saying she'd be late finishing paperwork. He'd reheated dinner and waited. By midnight, terror gripped him. Arthur checked his alibi, his financial records, his phone logs. Everything checked out clean. He was just a husband, desperate to find his wife. One neighbor mentioned seeing a dark pickup truck parked near their street that Friday evening, but couldn't remember the make or model. Another thought they'd heard a car engine revving late that night, but wasn't certain of the time or location. These vague recollections went into the file, but led nowhere concrete. As Monday arrived and Vanessa had been missing for 3 days, Detective Arthur sat in his office reviewing the thin case file. A real estate agent drives home from work and disappears into the Phoenix night. No body, no car, no witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just a family torn apart and a community holding its breath, hoping for answers that refused to come. The investigation was only beginning, but already the cold reality was setting in. In a sprawling desert city where someone could vanish in countless directions, finding Vanessa seemed nearly impossible. What Detective Arthur didn't know yet was that the truth was closer than anyone imagined, hidden behind a familiar face that showed up at every search gathering, every prayer vigil, every community meeting. Someone who acted like a concerned friend, but carried a terrible secret that would stay buried for over 2 decades. As days turned into weeks with no sign of Vanessa, the neighborhood rallied around her family in ways that seemed heartwarming at the time. Casseroles appeared on the doorstep. Neighbors took turns organizing search parties, and the local community center became an informal headquarters for volunteers, distributing flyers across the Phoenix metro area. Among those who seemed most dedicated to helping was Vincent Morse, a 35-year-old mechanic who lived just 3 houses down. Vincent had moved to the street about 2 years earlier, quickly becoming known as the friendly neighbor who'd lend tools, help fix cars, and show up at every backyard barbecue with a 6-pack and easy conversation. Vincent appeared at the house almost daily after Vanessa vanished. He brought groceries, helped organize search parties, and sat with the family during those long, agonizing evenings when hope flickered like a dying candle. He held Noah on his lap, trying to distract the confused 7-year-old with stories, while adults whispered in hushed tones nearby. Detective Arthur noticed Vincent at every community meeting, always sitting in the front row, always the first to volunteer for search efforts. When Arthur interviewed neighbors about Vanessa, Vincent was quick to provide information, describing her as a wonderful person who deserved better than this mysterious disappearance. His concern seemed genuine, his tears real when he spoke about hoping she'd come home safe. Her husband leaned on Vincent during those darkest weeks. They'd sit on the back patio late into the night, and Vincent would listen as grief poured out in broken sentences. Vincent helped with practical matters too, keeping the yard maintained, fixing a broken fence, making sure the family had what they needed while they struggled through each day. But there were small things, details so minor that nobody noticed them at the time. Vincent always steered conversations away from certain topics when Detective Arthur asked questions at community gatherings. He seemed overly interested in what evidence police had found, what leads they were pursuing. He asked the family repeatedly whether Vanessa had mentioned any problems at work, any conflicts with clients, as if trying to direct suspicion elsewhere. One neighbor later recalled seeing Vincent's dark blue pickup truck parked on their street that Friday evening when Vanessa disappeared, though she couldn't remember the exact time. Another mentioned Vincent had seemed unusually quiet at a search gathering the following week, sitting off to the side rather than his typical center of attention presence. These observations went unnoticed in the chaos of those early weeks. Vincent was just the concerned neighbor, the helpful friend who stepped up when tragedy struck. Nobody suspected that behind his sympathetic expressions and volunteer efforts, he might be hiding something far darker. As spring turned to summer and the investigation into this cold case yielded nothing concrete, Vincent gradually pulled back from the family. His visits became less frequent. His offers of help tapered off. By autumn, he was just another neighbor waving from his driveway, the initial crisis having passed into a painful new normal. Years would go by with Vincent living 3 houses down from the family, whose lives he'd helped shatter. He'd attend the same neighborhood parties, shop at the same grocery stores, pass them on the street with a polite nod. Always there, always watching, always carrying a secret that would stay buried for over 2 decades. Because in 1989, before modern surveillance cameras on every corner and cell phone tracking, a missing person case could go cold fast when the person responsible knew exactly how to act. Concerned while evidence lay hidden beneath dark water, waiting to surface when the desert finally gave up its secrets. By summer 1989, the investigation into Vanessa's disappearance had stalled completely. Detective Arthur sat in his office reviewing the file for what felt like the 100th time, finding nothing new to pursue. Every lead had been exhausted, every witness interviewed, every road searched. The silver Honda Accord had vanished as completely as its driver. The police department held a press conference in June, 3 months after Vanessa went missing, asking the public for any information that might crack this cold case. Detective Arthur stood before cameras and reporters, describing the missing person case that had baffled investigators across Maricopa County. Tips flooded the hotline for days afterward, but each one led nowhere. Someone thought they'd seen Vanessa at a gas station in Flagstaff, but it was a different woman. Another caller reported a silver car abandoned near Tucson, but the plates didn't match. Hope flickered and died over and over. Her husband tried to keep the case alive in any way he could. He appeared on local television programs, his face gaunt and exhausted, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. He offered a reward from their savings, posted updated flyers throughout Phoenix, and refused to accept that Vanessa was gone forever. But as months turned into a year, even the most dedicated volunteers began to drift away. Noah started 2nd grade that fall, the only kid in his class whose mother had disappeared without a trace. Other children asked questions he couldn't answer. Teachers looked at him with pity he didn't want. And every school event that required parental involvement became a painful reminder of what he'd lost. During the holiday concert, he watched other kids wave to their mothers in the audience, while the seat where Vanessa should have been sitting remained empty. The family marked Vanessa's birthday in November with a small gathering, lighting candles and sharing memories that grew hazier with each passing month. Her husband kept her belongings exactly as she'd left them, her clothes still hanging in the closet, her makeup arranged on the bathroom counter, as if she might walk through the door at any moment and resume the life that had been stolen. By 1990, the case had gone cold in every official sense. Detective Arthur had moved on to newer investigations, Though Vanessa's file stayed on his desk, a reminder of the unsolved mystery that haunted him, police resources were limited, and without new evidence or witnesses, there was simply nowhere else to look. The missing person report remained open, but active investigation had ceased. Vincent continued living 3 houses down, his presence a constant in the neighborhood. He attended block parties and holiday gatherings, waved to Noah when the boy rode his bike past, exchanged small talk with neighbors at the mailbox. To everyone around him, he was just Vincent, the mechanic who'd tried to help during that terrible time when Vanessa vanished. Nobody suspected that behind his ordinary facade, he carried knowledge that could answer every question the family had been asking for over a year. The years began to pile up like dust on forgotten furniture. 1991, 1992, 1993. Noah grew from a confused 7-year-old into an angry teenager, his childhood marked by an absence that shaped everything about who he became. He watched his father age decades in just a few years, watched hope fade from eyes that once sparkled with life. The house that used to ring with Vanessa's laughter became a quiet monument to loss. The community slowly forgot, as communities always do when tragedy becomes old news. New families moved into the neighborhood, people who'd never known Vanessa, never attended the vigils or search parties. To them, the family was just the sad household 3 doors down from Vincent's place, nothing more than a tragic story that predated their arrival. But for those who remembered, one question never stopped echoing through their minds. What happened to Vanessa that Friday night in March 1989? The answer was closer than anyone imagined, hidden beneath water in a reservoir that wouldn't give up its secrets for over 2 decades. Noah grew up carrying a weight most children never knew existed. While his classmates complained about their mothers embarrassing them at school events or being too strict about homework, Noah would have given anything just to have his mother there to embarrass him. The missing person case that had consumed his childhood became the defining feature of his entire life. By the time Noah reached high school in the late 1990s, most people in the neighborhood had stopped mentioning Vanessa. The story had faded into local history, just another unsolved mystery that Phoenix carried like so many others. But for Noah, every birthday, every graduation, every milestone became a reminder of who wasn't there to celebrate with him. His father did his best to fill both roles, showing up to baseball games and school concerts, helping with homework at the kitchen table. But Noah could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the way grief had carved lines into his face that shouldn't have been there for a man still in his 40s. They never talked about moving away from the neighborhood, never discussed selling the house where Vanessa's presence still lingered in every corner. Vincent still lived 3 houses down, a constant presence that Noah had grown up seeing almost daily. As a teenager, Noah began to notice things that had escaped his 7-year-old awareness. The way Vincent watched their house a little too carefully, how he always seemed to be outside when Noah left for school or came home. The uncomfortable feeling that settled in Noah's stomach whenever they crossed paths on the sidewalk. One afternoon, when Noah was 16, he asked his father directly about Vincent. They were sitting on the back patio, the Arizona sun beating down mercilessly, when Noah said what he'd been thinking for months. Something about Vincent doesn't feel right. His father had gone quiet for a long time before responding that Detective Arthur had investigated everyone in the neighborhood back in 1989, including Vincent, and found nothing suspicious. But Noah couldn't shake the feeling. He started researching cold cases in the Phoenix Public Library, reading everything he could find about missing persons investigations and how they were solved. He learned that many cases remained unsolved for decades before new technology or a fresh witness brought answers. He read about families who never gave up, who kept pushing police departments to reopen files, who refused to let their loved ones become forgotten statistics. When Noah turned 18 in 2000, he made a promise to himself and to his mother's memory. He would never stop looking for answers. He visited the Phoenix Police Department and asked to speak with whoever handled cold cases now. Detective Arthur had retired years earlier, and the new investigators listened politely to the young man's request to reopen his mother's case. They explained gently that without new evidence or witnesses, there was simply nothing more they could do. Noah refused to accept that answer. He created a website dedicated to Vanessa's disappearance, posting her photo and details of the case, hoping someone somewhere might remember something from that Friday night in March 1989. He printed new flyers every year on the anniversary of her disappearance and distributed them throughout Phoenix, even though most people threw them away without a second glance. His father worried that Noah's obsession with this unsolved mystery was preventing him from living his own life. But Noah saw it differently. Finding out what happened to his mother wasn't just about closure, it was about justice. Someone out there knew what happened that night, and Noah believed that truth had a way of surfacing eventually. Through his 20s, Noah balanced work and his personal investigation. He taught himself about forensic science, followed developments in DNA technology, and maintained contact with victim advocacy groups across Arizona. He attended conferences on missing persons cases and learned from families who'd been searching even longer than he had. Vincent remained in the neighborhood, aging into a gray-haired man in his 50s, still living 3 houses down like a splinter Noah couldn't remove. Sometimes Noah would drive past Vincent's house late at night, watching the lights in the windows, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind those walls. What Noah didn't know was that the answers he'd been seeking for over 2 decades were closer than he imagined, waiting beneath the surface of Lake Pleasant Reservoir, where Arizona's brutal drought would soon expose secrets the desert had kept hidden since 1989. October 2012 brought one of the worst droughts Arizona had seen in decades. Lake Pleasant Reservoir, about 30 miles northwest of Phoenix, had been shrinking steadily for 3 years. The massive body of water that once covered 10,000 acres was now exposing shorelines that hadn't seen sunlight since the new Waddell Dam was completed in 1994. The drought had dropped water levels by nearly 80 feet, revealing a haunting landscape of cracked earth, exposed tree stumps, and the ghostly remnants of what once lay beneath. Boaters who'd frequented the lake for years were shocked at how far the waterline had receded, leaving vast stretches of dried lake bed baking under the relentless Arizona sun. On a cool Saturday morning, 2 hunters named Marcus and Todd were tracking deer along the exposed western shore of the reservoir. They'd been coming to this area for hunting season for years, but the drought had transformed the landscape into something unrecognizable. Where water had once lapped at rocky shores, now stretched hundreds of yards of dusty, cracked mud. Marcus spotted something unusual about 50 yards ahead, a geometric shape that didn't belong in the natural landscape. As they approached, both men stopped dead in their tracks. Half buried in dried mud sat a silver sedan, its body covered in algae and sediment, windows shattered, the entire vehicle tilted at an odd angle. Todd pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911, his voice shaking as he reported their discovery. Within an hour, Maricopa County Sheriff's deputies had cordoned off the area. Detective Arthur Larkin, now 65 and technically retired, but still consulting on cold cases, received a call that afternoon that would change everything. When Arthur arrived at Lake Pleasant, his heart was already racing. He'd spent 23 years wondering what happened to Vanessa, carrying that unsolved mystery through his entire career and into retirement. Standing at the edge of the dried lake bed, looking down at the silver Honda Accord being carefully excavated by the forensics team, he felt time collapse. The license plate was barely readable under layers of dried algae, but when a technician wiped it clean, Arthur's breath caught. He recognized those numbers immediately from the file he'd reviewed countless times over 2 decades. This was Vanessa's car, the vehicle that vanished without a trace that Friday night, in March 1989. The forensics team worked methodically, photographing every angle before attempting to open the doors. When they finally pried open the driver's side, water and mud poured out, along with something that made even seasoned investigators step back. Human remains, partially preserved by the cold lake water, still sat behind the wheel. Arthur's hands trembled as he watched the team carefully document everything inside the vehicle. A purse wedged under the passenger seat contained a waterlogged wallet with Vanessa's real estate license still visible inside a plastic sleeve. Her Arizona driver's license, though faded and damaged, showed her smiling face from 1987. But what stopped everyone cold was the condition of the car itself. The steering wheel showed signs of damage consistent with impact. The front windshield had a spiderweb crack pattern suggesting blunt force. And most disturbing, the doors had been locked from the outside, the interior handles jammed in a way that suggested someone had deliberately trapped the occupant inside. This missing person case that had haunted Arthur for over 2 decades was suddenly a confirmed homicide. Someone hadn't just caused Vanessa to disappear. They'd deliberately drowned her, locking her inside her own car and pushing it into Lake Pleasant, where it would remain hidden for 23 years. News of the discovery spread fast through Phoenix. By evening, every local news station was broadcasting from Lake Pleasant, cameras capturing the silver Honda being carefully winched onto a flatbed truck. Reporters explained how the historic Drought had exposed this cold case, revealing evidence that had been underwater since 1989. Noah was at work when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, Detective Arthur's voice, weathered but unmistakable, delivered news that Noah had been waiting to hear his entire adult life. "We found your mother's car. We found her." After 23 years of searching, of refusing to give up hope, Noah finally had an answer. But with that answer came a devastating truth he'd suspected but never wanted to believe. His mother hadn't disappeared. She'd been murdered. Someone had taken her life and hidden the evidence beneath dark water, counting on it never being found. The silver Honda was transported to the Maricopa County Forensics Laboratory, where a team of specialists began the painstaking process of examining every inch of the vehicle that had spent 23 years underwater. Detective Arthur stood behind the observation glass, watching technicians carefully document each piece of evidence recovered from Vanessa's car. Modern forensic technology in 2012 was light years ahead of what had been available back in 1989 when this cold case first began. DNA analysis that was barely in its infancy when Vanessa disappeared had now become the gold standard for solving crimes. Arthur knew that if there was any biological evidence left in that car after 2 decades underwater, the lab could extract and analyze it in ways that would have seemed like science fiction 23 years ago. The forensics team worked methodically, swabbing every surface inside the vehicle. The steering wheel yielded traces of DNA, as did the driver's seat and door handle. Most critically, they found biological material on the passenger side as well, suggesting someone else had been in the car with Vanessa that night. Noah visited the police station almost daily, desperate for updates on the investigation into his mother's death. Detective Arthur met with him in a small conference room, explaining that this missing person case had officially become a homicide investigation. The evidence was clear that Vanessa hadn't driven into Lake Pleasant accidentally. Someone had been with her, someone who'd forced that car into the water and left her to drown. The DNA samples were sent to the FBI laboratory for analysis and comparison against CODIS, the national database containing millions of genetic profiles from across the country. Arthur explained to Noah that this process could take weeks or even months, but it offered the best chance of identifying who'd been in that car with his mother. While waiting for DNA results, Arthur reopened every aspect of the original investigation from 1989. He reviewed witness statements, re-interviewed people who still lived in the area, and studied the geography around Lake Pleasant. The reservoir was about 40 miles from where Vanessa worked, accessible via Highway 74. Someone familiar with the area would have known that submerging a car there meant it might never be found. Arthur created a timeline of Vanessa's final hours. She left work around 7 that Friday evening. Her car was seen heading west on Camelback Road, but after that, all traces disappeared. Somewhere between her office and home, someone had intercepted her, gotten into her car, and driven north toward Lake Pleasant instead of west toward her neighborhood. The detective kept returning to one uncomfortable question. Who would Vanessa have let into her car willingly? A stranger forcing their way in would have left signs of struggle at the office parking lot, but there were none. This suggested she knew her attacker, trusted them enough to let them approach her vehicle. Arthur pulled out the old neighborhood canvass reports from 1989, reading through names of everyone who'd lived near the family back then. One name kept appearing in multiple witness statements, always described as helpful, concerned, eager to assist with the search. Vincent Morse, the neighbor who lived just 3 houses down. Something about those reports nagged at Arthur's memory. Vincent had been almost too involved, too present during those early days of the investigation. And when Arthur checked the old vehicle registration records, he found something that made his pulse quicken. In March 1989, Vincent had owned a dark blue Chevrolet pickup truck, the same type of vehicle a witness had vaguely mentioned seeing near Vanessa's street the night she disappeared, a detail so minor it had been buried in the file for over 2 decades. But now, with Vanessa's body recovered and forensic evidence being processed, that small detail suddenly seemed far more significant. Arthur knew he needed to wait for the DNA results before making any moves. But deep in his gut, he felt the answer to this cold case had been hiding in plain sight for 23 years, living just 3 houses away from the family he'd destroyed. 3 weeks after Vanessa's car was recovered from Lake Pleasant, Detective Arthur received the call he'd been waiting for. The FBI lab had completed their DNA analysis, and the results were ready. He drove to the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that morning with his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since he was a rookie detective decades ago. The forensic report was spread across the conference table when Arthur arrived. The lead analyst walked him through the findings, pointing to highlighted sections that would crack this cold case wide open. The DNA recovered from the passenger seat, door handle, and steering wheel had been successfully extracted despite 23 years underwater. And when run through CODIS, the national database had produced a match. Vincent Morse. The name hit Arthur like a physical blow. The helpful neighbor who'd attended every search party, who'd comforted the family, who'd lived 3 houses away for all these years while carrying the secret of what he'd done. Arthur reviewed Vincent's file, which showed a minor arrest record from the early 80s for assault during a domestic dispute, enough to put his DNA in the system. Noah was brought in immediately to hear the results. When Detective Arthur told him that forensic evidence revealed Vincent had been inside his mother's car the night she died, Noah's face went white. He sat motionless for several long moments before speaking. He gave me candy when I was 7. He helped search for my mom. He was at our house almost every day after she disappeared. The betrayal in his voice was crushing to witness. Arthur explained that the DNA evidence was conclusive proof Vincent had been in the vehicle, but they needed more to build a prosecutable homicide case. They needed motive, opportunity, and ideally a confession or witness testimony that could explain why a trusted neighbor would commit such a terrible act. The detective began pulling together everything they had on Vincent. In 1989, he'd been 35 years old, unmarried, working as a mechanic at a shop on the west side of Phoenix. Neighbors from back then described him as friendly, but sometimes intense, particularly around women. One former neighbor recalled Vincent asking about Vanessa frequently, always wanting to know where she was, what she was doing, whether she was happy in her marriage. Arthur interviewed the family again, this time asking specifically about Vincent's behavior before the disappearance. They remembered he'd started coming around more often in early 1989, always finding excuses to stop by. He'd offer to fix things that weren't broken, show up uninvited to family gatherings, linger longer than other guests. Vanessa had mentioned to her husband once that Vincent made her uncomfortable, but she'd brushed it off as him just being awkward and lonely. The detective also discovered that Vincent had sold his dark blue pickup truck in late 1989, just months after Vanessa vanished. The new owner had scrapped it years ago, destroying potential evidence. But the timing was suspicious, suggesting Vincent had wanted to eliminate anything that might connect him to the crime. When Arthur pulled phone records from March 1989, archived in dusty storage boxes, he found something that made the case even stronger. Vincent had called Vanessa's office the afternoon she disappeared, a detail that had seemed innocent at the time, but now took on sinister meaning. He'd likely been checking to see if she was working late, confirming she'd be alone in the parking lot. The pieces fit together into a disturbing picture. Vincent had been obsessed with Vanessa, watching her, learning her routines. That Friday night, he'd waited for her in the parking lot, approached her car with some excuse that made her let him in. Maybe he claimed he needed help, or wanted to talk. Once inside the vehicle, something had gone terribly wrong. Whether he'd planned to kill her or events spiraled out of control, the result was the same. Vincent had driven that car to Lake Pleasant, with Vanessa trapped inside, and pushed it into the dark water, where he believed it would never be found. Detective Arthur knew they had enough evidence for an arrest. The DNA placed Vincent in the car. The circumstantial evidence showed obsession and opportunity, and the physical evidence from the vehicle suggested this was no accident, but a deliberate act. After 23 years, this missing person case was finally about to see justice. But before making the arrest, Arthur wanted to try something risky. He wanted to interview Vincent, see if the weight of knowing his secret was finally exposed might break him into a confession. Because DNA could prove Vincent was in the car, but only Vincent could explain why he'd stolen a mother from her child and left a family shattered for over 2 decades. Detective Arthur arranged for Vincent to come to the station for questioning, carefully avoiding language that might alert him this was more than a routine interview. Vincent arrived on a gray November afternoon in 2012, now 58 years old, his hair fully gray, his mechanic's hands weathered by decades of work. Arthur led him to an interrogation room, the walls bare except for a mirror concealing cameras recording every word and gesture. Vincent sat down across from the detective, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. Arthur started slow, asking about the old neighborhood, about life back in 1989, letting Vincent settle into what felt like casual conversation between 2 men revisiting the past. Then Arthur mentioned the discovery at Lake Pleasant. Vincent's face remained neutral, but Arthur noticed his hands tighten slightly on the armrests. The detective explained that hunters had found a silver Honda Accord, that forensic evidence recovered from the vehicle had been analyzed using modern DNA technology unavailable 23 years ago. Vincent shifted in his chair, his voice careful as he asked what this had to do with him. Arthur leaned forward, his tone still conversational, but carrying weight. Because the DNA results came back with a match. Your DNA was found inside that car, on the steering wheel, on the passenger seat, on the door handles. You were in the vehicle with Vanessa the night she died. The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. Vincent's facade began to crack, his breathing becoming shallow, his eyes darting to the door, as if calculating escape routes. Arthur kept talking, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The phone call Vincent made to her office that afternoon, the witness who saw his truck near the neighborhood, the obsessive behavior neighbors had mentioned. Vincent tried to maintain innocence, claiming he must have been in her car at some other time, maybe giving her a ride, or helping with something. But Arthur was prepared for this. The forensic analysis showed exactly where Vincent's DNA was located, in positions consistent with someone driving the vehicle, someone who'd been in that car during its final journey to Lake Pleasant. Arthur changed tactics, speaking more softly about how these things sometimes happened, how obsession could cloud judgment, how one moment of terrible decision could haunt someone for decades. He suggested that living with this secret for 23 years must have been exhausting, that perhaps Vincent wanted to finally tell the truth. Something broke inside Vincent then, his eyes filled with tears, his hands trembling as he covered his face. Arthur waited, letting the silence do its work, knowing that confessions often came not from aggressive interrogation, but from giving someone space to release the burden they'd carried too long. Vincent began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. He admitted he'd been in love with Vanessa, had become obsessed with her smile, her kindness, the way she moved through the world. He'd convinced himself they had a connection, that she felt something for him too, even though she was married. That Friday evening, he'd waited for her in the parking lot, approached her car claiming his truck had broken down and asking for a ride. She'd agreed because that was who Vanessa was, someone who helped neighbors in need. Vincent got in the passenger seat, directing her toward his supposed stalled vehicle. But instead of taking her to where he claimed his truck was parked, he'd pulled out a weapon, forcing her to drive north toward Lake Pleasant. Arthur listened without interrupting as Vincent described what happened next. He'd wanted to talk to her, to make her understand his feelings, to convince her to leave her family and be with him. But Vanessa had been terrified, pleading with him to let her go, to think about her husband and son. Her rejection had enraged him, the fantasy he'd built crashing down into humiliation and rage. At Lake Pleasant, in a moment Vincent described as losing control completely, he'd struck Vanessa with the weapon he'd brought, stunning her. Then he'd pushed her car toward the water with her still inside, watching as it sank beneath the dark surface. He'd walked back to where he'd hidden his truck, driven home, and spent the next 23 years pretending to be the concerned neighbor while knowing exactly where Vanessa had been the entire time. The confession was captured on video, every word documented for the prosecution. When Arthur finally stood and informed Vincent he was under arrest for the murder of Vanessa, the man who'd hidden behind a mask of normalcy for over 2 decades simply nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this moment since March 1989. As officers led Vincent away in handcuffs, Arthur sat alone in the interrogation room, thinking about the family who'd lived just 3 houses away from their mother's killer for all those years, never knowing the truth was so close. Vincent's confession gave prosecutors everything they needed to file formal charges. In December 2012, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office announced they would be charging Vincent with first-degree murder in the death of Vanessa. The news spread through Phoenix like wildfire, with local television stations breaking into regular programming to report that this cold case from 1989 had finally been solved. Noah sat in his living room watching the press conference, seeing Vincent's booking photo flash across the screen. The man who'd given him candy as a child, who'd pretended to help search for his mother, was now being exposed as the person who'd taken her life. The betrayal cut deeper than Noah had imagined possible. The neighborhood where they'd all lived for so many years erupted in shock and disbelief. Neighbors who remembered Vincent from back then couldn't reconcile the friendly mechanic they'd known with the cold-blooded killer described in police reports. Some refused to believe it at first, insisting there must be some mistake. But as details of the DNA evidence and confession became public, denial gave way to a sick realization. Detective Arthur attended a community meeting held at the local recreation center, where dozens of former neighbors gathered to process what they'd learned. People spoke in hushed voices about the barbecues Vincent had attended, the times he'd helped fix their cars or lent them tools. One woman broke down crying, remembering how Vincent had held her hand at a candlelight vigil for Vanessa, while knowing exactly where she was the entire time. Noah stood before the group and spoke, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. For 23 years, this missing person case haunted our family. We lived 3 houses away from the person who murdered my mother, and he acted like our friend. He sat at our table. He looked my father in the eye while carrying this terrible secret. The room fell silent, the weight of those words settling over everyone present. Vincent was held without bond at the Maricopa County Jail while awaiting trial. His defense attorneys argued that the confession had been coerced, that the DNA evidence could be explained by innocent contact with Vanessa's car at some earlier time. But prosecutors had built an overwhelming case that left little room for reasonable doubt. The forensic evidence told a clear story. Vincent's DNA was exactly where it would be if he'd driven that car to Lake Pleasant. The confession provided details only the killer would know, including the specific location where he'd entered the water and the weapon he'd used. Witnesses came forward describing Vincent's obsessive behavior toward Vanessa in the months before her disappearance. Noah visited his mother's grave for the first time since her remains had been properly buried, after being recovered from the lake. He knelt beside the headstone, finally able to tell her that justice was coming, that the person who'd stolen her life would face consequences for what he'd done. Detective Arthur compiled the final case file, hundreds of pages documenting 23 years of investigation from the initial missing person report in March 1989 to Vincent's arrest in November 2012. He reflected on how this unsolved mystery had defined much of his career, how he'd carried Vanessa's case into retirement, never quite letting go of the hope that someday answers would surface. The breakthrough in this cold case came from a combination of factors: the historic drought that exposed Lake Pleasant's lakebed, the hunters who discovered the car, the advancement in DNA technology that could extract and analyze genetic material after decades underwater, and persistence from a son who refused to let his mother be forgotten. As 2012 turned into 2013, Phoenix prepared for a trial that would finally bring closure to one of the area's most haunting, unsolved cases. Vincent sat in his cell, knowing that the secret he'd kept for over 2 decades was now public knowledge, that the mask he'd worn for so long had finally been ripped away to reveal the truth underneath. The trial began in May 2013 at the Maricopa County Superior Court in downtown Phoenix. News crews lined the courthouse steps as Noah arrived each morning, walking past reporters who'd been covering this cold case since the discovery at Lake Pleasant 6 months earlier. Inside the courtroom, dozens of spectators filled every available seat, many of them neighbors who remembered Vanessa from 1989. The prosecution presented their case methodically over 3 weeks. They brought in forensic experts who explained how DNA technology had advanced since this missing person case first began, how genetic material could survive underwater for 23 years and still provide conclusive identification. The jury listened intently as scientists described finding Vincent's DNA on the steering wheel and passenger seat exactly where it would be if he'd driven the car to its watery grave. Detective Arthur took the stand, walking the jury through the original investigation and explaining how this unsolved mystery had haunted him throughout his career. He described the missing person report filed that March night in 1989, the searches that yielded nothing, the years of dead ends. Then he detailed how the drought at Lake Pleasant had finally exposed the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface for over 2 decades. The medical examiner testified about the remains recovered from the Honda Accord. Though decomposition made exact cause of death difficult to determine, evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull was consistent with Vincent's confession. The forensic analysis of the car itself showed the doors had been deliberately jammed, trapping Vanessa inside as the vehicle sank. But the most powerful testimony came from those who knew both Vanessa and Vincent. Neighbors described Vincent's obsessive behavior in early 1989, how he'd watch Vanessa's house, find excuses to visit, ask constant questions about her whereabouts. Former co-workers from Desert Realty remembered Vanessa mentioning that a neighbor made her uncomfortable, though she'd never reported it formally because she didn't want to cause trouble. The defense argued that the confession had been coerced, that Vincent had been exhausted and confused during interrogation. They claimed the DNA evidence only proved Vincent had been in Vanessa's car at some point, not necessarily the night she died. But prosecutors played the videotaped confession, letting the jury watch Vincent describe in his own words how he'd waited for Vanessa, forced her to drive to Lake Pleasant, and left her to drown when she rejected his obsessive advances. Noah gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. Standing at the podium, he described growing up without his mother, the empty chair at every birthday and graduation, the questions that haunted him throughout childhood. He spoke about living 3 houses away from Vincent for years, never knowing the man who gave him candy and pretended to help search was actually responsible for destroying his family. The defense presented character witnesses who described Vincent as a quiet, helpful neighbor, suggesting the crime was out of character and perhaps accidental rather than premeditated. But the prosecution countered with evidence of Vincent's prior assault charge and testimony from ex-girlfriends who described his controlling, obsessive behavior when relationships ended. After 3 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on a Friday afternoon in late May. Noah sat in the courthouse cafeteria with his father and Detective Arthur, waiting for a verdict that would determine whether this cold case that had consumed over 2 decades of their lives would finally receive justice. The jury deliberated for 8 hours over 2 days. When the bailiff announced they'd reached a verdict, the courtroom filled quickly. Vincent sat at the defense table, his face emotionless, as the jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Vanessa, the jury found Vincent guilty. Noah buried his face in his hands as the verdict was read, his father's arm around his shoulders. 24 years after Vanessa disappeared on that Friday evening in March 1989, 12 strangers had affirmed what her family had always known. She hadn't left willingly, hadn't abandoned them by choice. She'd been taken by someone they'd trusted, someone who'd hidden behind a mask of neighborly concern while knowing exactly where she was the entire time. As Vincent was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, he glanced briefly at Noah. Whatever he saw in that young man's eyes, the son who'd spent his entire life searching for answers, made Vincent look away quickly. The secret he'd carried for over 2 decades had finally been exposed, and justice, though delayed by years of silence, had arrived at last. 2 months after the guilty verdict, Vincent returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom filled again with those who'd followed this cold case since the discovery at Lake Pleasant. Noah sat in the front row alongside his father and Detective Arthur, all 3 men who'd carried the weight of this unsolved mystery for over 2 decades, finally seeing the end of their long journey. The judge reviewed the evidence presented during trial, the DNA that placed Vincent in Vanessa's car, the confession detailing how obsession had turned deadly, the 23 years this family had lived without answers, while the perpetrator walked free just 3 houses away. The judge spoke directly to Vincent, describing how the missing person case that began in March 1989 had revealed not just a murder, but a profound betrayal of trust. Noah delivered his final statement before sentencing, standing at the podium with steady voice despite the emotion behind his words. He described what it meant to grow up knowing his mother had vanished without a trace, to spend his entire childhood wondering if she'd abandoned him, to learn as an adult that she'd been murdered by someone who pretended to be a friend. He spoke about the 23 years his family had been denied closure, the birthdays and graduations, and milestones his mother had missed because Vincent's obsession had spiraled into violence. The judge sentenced Vincent to life in prison without possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, Noah felt something shift inside him that he hadn't experienced in over 2 decades. Not happiness exactly, because nothing could bring his mother back, but a sense that the chapter that had defined his entire existence was finally closing, that Vanessa's story would end, not with mystery, but with justice. Outside the courthouse afterward, Noah spoke briefly to the gathered media. He thanked Detective Arthur for never giving up on this cold case, for carrying it through retirement and seeing it through to resolution. He thanked the hunters who'd discovered his mother's car in the dried lake bed of Lake Pleasant. And he spoke about how this missing person case had taught him that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even when buried beneath dark water for over 2 decades. Detective Arthur stood beside Noah, reflecting on how this unsolved mystery had defined much of his career. He'd retired years ago with Vanessa's case still open, never imagining that a historic drought would expose the evidence needed to finally crack it. The advancement in DNA technology, the persistence of a son who refused to let his mother be forgotten, and the natural forces that drained Lake Pleasant had all conspired to bring truth to light after 23 years of darkness. The family held a memorial service for Vanessa at the same church where vigils had been held back in 1989. But this time, instead of desperate prayers for her safe return, they celebrated her life and mourned her death with the certainty of knowing what had happened. Neighbors who remembered her from over 2 decades ago shared stories of her kindness, her dedication to helping families find homes, the warmth that had made her beloved in the community. Noah visited his mother's grave after the sentencing, kneeling beside the headstone that finally bore accurate dates. For the first time since he was 7 years old, he could speak to her without the weight of unanswered questions. He told her about the trial, about Vincent being held accountable, about how the secret that had been hidden for so long had finally been exposed. He promised her that her story would be remembered not as an unsolved mystery, but as proof that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. The neighborhood where they'd all lived transformed in the years following Vincent's conviction. The house where he'd lived for so long was sold, new families moving in who knew nothing of its dark history. The street became just another Phoenix suburb, the tragedy that had marked it for over 2 decades fading into local history. But for Noah, the resolution of this cold case meant he could finally move forward with his own life. He'd spent 23 years frozen in the moment his mother disappeared, unable to fully embrace the future while the past remained unresolved. Now, with Vincent behind bars and Vanessa's story complete, Noah began to imagine possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider before. Detective Arthur kept in touch with the family, their shared experience binding them together in ways that transcended the typical relationship between investigator and victim's family. He'd carried this missing person case through his entire career, and seeing it resolved gave his decades of service a sense of completion he'd never expected to feel. The story of Vanessa's disappearance and the 23 years it took to solve this cold case became a reminder of how murder investigations had evolved since 1989. DNA technology that didn't exist when she first vanished had proven crucial to identifying her killer. The persistence of law enforcement and family members who refused to let the case be forgotten had kept hope alive through decades of silence. What made this case particularly haunting was the betrayal at its core. Vincent hadn't been a stranger lurking in shadows, but a familiar face at neighborhood gatherings, someone trusted enough to approach Vanessa's car without raising alarm. The family had lived just 3 houses away from their mother's killer for years, never suspecting that the helpful neighbor carried such a terrible secret. As 2013 drew to a close, Noah reflected on the journey from that Friday night in March 1989, when his mother failed to come home to the courthouse steps in Phoenix, where justice had finally been served. The drought that exposed Lake Pleasant's secrets had given his family something they'd been denied for over 2 decades. Answers, closure, and the knowledge that Vanessa hadn't been forgotten. The cold case that haunted Phoenix for 23 years had reached its conclusion, proving that even when truth lies hidden beneath dark water for decades, eventually the desert gives up its secrets and justice finds its way home.